I'm very privileged to be back here and to share my ideas with you. I'm glad Professor Roy Auger is actually in the audience because I'm one of his students. There's another one over there, Richard Pierce, Ambassador Pierce. But I mentioned Dr. Auger because one of the things he admonished us to do as historians is to tell the truth. That's our first obligation. Some of what I might say this afternoon might displease some of you, but it's a function of extensive research, and everything I say I can back up with the evidence. I am not a propagandist, and I shall say things that will infuriate any partisans in the audience. So here goes. Jamaica became an independent state, notice the word state, on August 6, 1962. The island had endured a long history of colonial rule. Christopher Columbus declared it a Spanish possession in 1494, and it remained a part of Spain's empire for 161 years. The English seized the island in 1655 and held it until 1962, approximately 307 years. Taken together, Jamaica was a possession of these two European nations for 468 years. It was the quintessential colony, productive, valuable, loyal, imitative in its habits, and fervently patriotic for the most part. Africans labored in the island for 327 years, from 1511, when slavery was first introduced, and until 1838, when it was finally abolished. Slavery's imprint was everywhere. It was reflected in the racial demography of the people, social relations, etiquettes of control and subservience, and a wounded and perverted sense of individual and racial identities. One of the most important dates in Jamaica's history is September 19, 1961. On that day, Jamaicans went to the polls to resolve the island's political future. It was the island's first referendum and remains the only one in its history. The electorate had to answer a simple question, but one that had the potential to alter fundamentally the political trajectory of their homeland. Should Jamaica remain in the Federation? The question asked. The campaign was long, hard-fought, and even violent. Norman Manley led the pro-Federation forces, and Alexander Bustamante was the principal voice of the secessionists. The West Indies Federation had come into being in January 1958, and its brief history had been a source of much disharmony in the island. When Bustamante and the party he led declined to contest a by-election to fill a vacant seat in the federal parliament in mid-1960, Premier Manley decided to call a referendum on the issue. When the votes were counted, the majority of the people decided to leave the Union. The first call for self-government for Jamaica originated not here, but in New York. It came from the Jamaica Progressive League. Founded in 1936 by the distinguished journalist W.A. Domingo, the Unitarian minister Etheldred Brown, the writer and historian W. Adolph Roberts, the League was committed to the acquisition of self-government and dominion status for the island. The Jamaican branch of the League was founded in 1937, a year preceding the formation of the People's National Party. The PNP defined itself as a nationalist party, although it did not, and I stress not, it did not embrace self-government or dominion status as an immediate goal. Manley initially believed that Jamaicans were not ready for self-government. As he said in a letter that I discovered, he said, "I'm not an imperialist. I have never disguised my views on that. At the same time, I am not a believer in independence for Jamaica. It is utterly and childishly impracticable." By late 1940, however, he had changed his position. And here I'm going to quote, "The great and overwhelming reason why self-government is imperative for people," Manley told a huge audience at the Ward Theatre in 1941, "is that without it, it is impossible for the people of the country to grow into manhood." The audience applauded when Manley said, "The only fitness of a people for self-government is their own demand for it, their own willingness to accept the responsibilities of it." Manley played a fundamental role in the struggle to obtain a new constitution. Members of the Legislative Council were not yet ready to support the call for self-government, but they were receptive to the acquisition of more power in the island's political system. Issued in 1943, the new constitution granted universal adult suffrage to the people, but failed to introduce self-government. It promised, however, to review the document in 5 years. Undaunted, Manley reaffirmed his commitment to self-government for the island, asserting that, quote, "This thing to me is a religion." Alexander Bustamante, the newly minted labor leader, did not play an active role in the early struggle for self-government. Bustamante was on the platform when the PNP was founded in September 1938. He did not become a member of the party until the following year, 1939, at which time he urged his followers, as he put the masses of this island, he said, to follow his example and join the PNP. It was a short-lived political marriage. Bustamante disliked the PNP's embrace of socialism, conflating socialism with communism. Writing a letter in the Daily Gleaner in March 1939, Bustamante linked Manley to communism. "It is unfortunate," he wrote, "that the present founder of the People's National Party has allowed himself to be hoodwinked and surrounded with so much of the philosophy of communism, which has destroyed and distorted governments of a greater magnitude than that of Jamaica, leaving them in a pitiful and sorrowful condition." Governor Arthur Richards overreacted to Bustamante's appeal to the workers, fearing that he would eventually become Manley's ally in the cause of self-government. Using very questionable evidence against him, Richards had Bustamante interned from September 1941 to February 1943. To obtain his release from the internment camp, Bustamante volunteered to sever his ties with the PNP, a decision that the governor welcomed. To assure the colonial authorities that he was a loyal colonial, Bustamante wrote a lengthy letter to the colonial secretary in which he declared that he was, quote, "not mad for self-government," and that if he had wanted to, quote, "unite myself with the tiny negative minority which call themselves self-government seekers, I would have launched out for self-government. For I have the people behind me, the middle, the low, and some of the high. I have not much desire, nor no itch for self-government, nor any desire whatsoever for the time being, to be separated from England. I have never in my life advocated immediate self-government, neither in secret nor in public. He said that he was, quote, the most consistent and determined opponent of self-government now. Bustamante said he was founding a political party in which self-government was not included. Bustamante, as you know, kept his word, and when he founded the Jamaica Labour Party in 1943, its brief platform was silent on the question of self-government for Jamaica. Thus, as Jamaica held its first general election under the aegis of universal adult suffrage in 1944, Manley and Bustamante, and I stress this, held dramatically opposite positions on Jamaica's political future. Manley and the PNP had taken policy positions advancing the cause of self-government. Bustamante, as the leader of the JLP, seemed not to be able to imagine such a future for the island. The JLP never took a position on the question. It was not a party that was run on democratic principles, and Bustamante's position on a particular issue became the party's position. That said, while Manley was consistent in his embrace of self-government, Bustamante was consistently inconsistent. On June 20th, 1945, he explained to the House of Representatives why he opposed immediate self-government for the island. And here I'm quoting from Hansard. Mr. Bustamante, this is what he said: I oppose immediate self-government, and I oppose more so those who are clamoring for self-government now. Why? The reply is this: most are atheists who do not believe in God. Mr. Glasspool, rubbish. Mr. Bustamante, most are persons who believe or try to lead the people to believe that if they get self-government, they will be able to go to the man who had property with 10 cows and say, now I will divide your 10 cows, giving 5 to the self-governing sea cow, who is lazy, who is a lazy man, and won't work. Mr. Glasspool, rank stupidity. Bustamante was alluding to the existing propaganda that the PNP was a socialist party, that the PNP as a socialist party would seize the property of ordinary Jamaicans if it assumed power. Addressing a group of his supporters in Port Maria in July 1946, Bustamante affirmed his vision for Jamaica's political future. This is an excerpt from his speech. As loyal British subjects, he said to the audience, let us pray together that this British Empire will live and live until there is no more life in the world, which is timeless. But Bustamante was unpredictable, a man full of surprises. He chafed under the lack of power that was accorded to the 5 executive councillors who had constituted an embryonic ministerial system. Remember that the original persons from 45 to 53 who were appointed to the embryonic cabinet, so to speak, had very little authority, very little power. And Bustamante chafed under that because he couldn't do much. They were not called ministers, they were called councillors. As you shall see, the ministerial system came into being in 1953. Bustamante, by the way, named himself the Councillor for Communications. Harold Allen was the Councillor for Social Welfare, and Pixley, I think, was Councillor for Agriculture, and so on. But they were not ministers, although Bustamante called them ministers. But in terms of the Constitution, they were executive councillors. But having said that, Bustamante did try to suggest that the councillors should have more power than they actually had. On July 9th, 1947, Bustamante gave one of the most incendiary speeches that Jamaica had yet heard on the question of self-government. Man was, I said, full of surprises. He denounced in that speech the colonial authorities for keeping Jamaicans, quote, in bondage. Continuing, Bustamante said, "We ought to tell the king, we ought to tell the Secretary of State that freedom is ours by right. He has no right, that is to say the king, to restrict our freedom. We are not going to get it by begging." Bustamante said Britain should be told that we don't want you to rule us anymore. This is the same person who in 42 had said he was not in favor of self-government. And here's a remarkable part of his speech, which he gave and was cheered for. This is what he says: "I do hope that in the near future we will be governing ourselves, and some of us who have little feelings that some people are better than us, these feelings will vanish. That thought is what has been keeping us back. We must make up our minds not to beg, but to demand that which is ours, freedom. We must make up our minds that no job in this country is too good for any of the colored people of this country. We must make up our minds that we can do better than many others have done. And I say that there is nothing in this country that any governor has done that I could not do better." Recognizing the significance of this speech, Florida Glasspool, the PNP member for Eastern Kingston, rose to congratulate Bustamante for making, quote, "one of the most impressive speeches I have ever heard in support of self-government." This was generous praise from a political adversary. Glasspool was pleased that Bustamante had now joined the PNP in demanding self-government. He recalled that on one occasion, Bustamante had said that self-government would mean, quote, "the oppression of the black people of this country by a small minority of brown people." "I thank God," Glasspool said, "he has changed that opinion." Bustamante's declaration took his party and the country by surprise. It was a spontaneous oration, but no one could be certain that it would remain his position and by extension that of the party that he led. The rhetorical power of the speech was tempered by the fact that it never received the imprimatur of a policy decision by the JLP. Consistency in the content of his pronouncements had never been Bustamante's strong suit. His future conduct would reveal whether his speech was merely a rhetorical outburst or a prescription for policy on Jamaica's future political path. One answer to these concerns came when Bustamante visited England in July 1948. Although he advocated freedom for Jamaica during the visit, his rhetoric was cautious and restrained. He conceded, however, that Jamaica merited a new constitution on, quote, "broader lines." He did not believe, he said, that Jamaica was ripe for dominion status, but said that the island deserved a full ministerial system. Bustamante emphasized that, quote, "however loyal we are to the British Empire and Commonwealth, and the majority of us, including myself, are pro-King and pro-British, we feel we are quite capable of running our country better than the governor can." Nothing tangible resulted from the trip, but Bustamante was honored with a 35-minute audience with the king. Returning to a tumultuous welcome in Kingston's Ward Theatre, he was able to proclaim, quote, "I used to be very fond of my king. I used to be very loyal, but today I adore and worship our majesty, the king." You see the contradictions here. He says one thing on one occasion and something else later. This was good political theater, but it also had a more serious dimension. Bustamante's expression of fealty to the crown was not contrived, nor was it unique in the island. Jamaicans had been socialized into being British subjects for 300 years, and the passionate embrace of a competing Jamaican identity would be slow, difficult, and contradictory. Bustamante's ambivalence on selfhood for the country was not an aberration either. In fact, few Jamaicans in the 1940s were given much thought to the island's political future. For those who did, the matter was becoming increasingly complicated by the initiation of a discussion on the formation of a West Indies Federation. Meeting in Montego Bay in September 1947, delegates from the various Anglophone territories decided provisionally to create such a union. And let me stress this, the discussion to create a federation continued simultaneously with that concerning constitutional advance for the island. Ultimately, it was expected that Jamaica would achieve self-government on its own, but Dominion status would come to a federation of the West Indies, of which Jamaica would be a part. The island's political leaders then faced the challenge of nurturing a Jamaican nationalism on the one hand and a larger West Indian nationalism on the other. Bustamante, it must be emphasized, never held a debate on the question of Jamaica's self-government during the first term that he was in office, that is to say from 1945 to 1949. The JLP, let me stress, at the time had no official policy on self-government, and none of its members dared to raise the issue given the leader's dictatorial command or control of the party and his intolerance of dissent or independent action by its members. Remember that in 1947 there was an enormous split in the ranks of the JLP because some members sought to take positions independent of that of the leader. Although Bustamante was consistently inconsistent, as I said, on the question of self-government for the island, it may be doubted that he really believed that Jamaicans were ill-equipped to govern themselves. His oft-repeated complaints that the executive councillors lacked the requisite power to initiate and implement policies suggested that at times he knew that Jamaicans could administer their own affairs if given the opportunity to do so. Bustamante, however, was not anxious to acquire the political power that he was sometimes demanding in public. With increased power came increased responsibility, and Bustamante preferred a status quo where the Crown's officials could be blamed for the island's problems. Constitutional advance would be sacrificed on the altar of domestic political imperatives. In 1951, for example, discussions on constitutional advance were stymied because of Bustamante's intransigence. He wanted Manley, as leader of the opposition, to sign a document stating that the two parties would not accept any constitutional advance that required a new election. Bustamante feared that the decline in popularity of the JLP at the time might ensure its defeat. Such an attitude, I would maintain, represented the triumph of narrow partisan interests over the good of the common weal. Jamaica's lethargy on the question of constitutional advance allowed some other colonies to pass her. They included Barbados, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast. Manley was frustrated by Jamaica's lack of progress and condemned the Bustamante administration for its myopia and inertia. He lectured his colleagues, he had a habit of doing that, in the House, on the responsibilities of leadership and challenged them to harness the people's spirit to create a nation. He noted that, and I'm quoting, whereas you cannot feed the people on constitutions, nor can you bring happiness by changing forms of government, you cannot create a spirit that can build a country and remain a subject people. You cannot weld together the will for service, sacrifice, and endeavor for people unless you link it to the passionate faith and belief in the people and its own destiny. Norman Manley and the PNP had remained steadfast in their advocacy of self-government for Jamaica since 1940. Bustamante and the JLP, after a decade of temporizing and inconsistency, finally endorsed the concept of self-government in 1952. This occurred in the face of a rising Jamaican nationalism, the emergence of nationalist movements in other parts of the Caribbean, and the vigor of the anti-colonial struggle in Asia and Africa. The JLP tried to reinvent itself as a nationalist party of long standing, but history stood in the way of that reincarnation. As Norman Manley told the House and the country in July 1951, after the Executive Councillor for Social Welfare had falsely declared that Bustamante was the architect of the Constitution that went into effect in 1944. This is what Manley said. That claim is one of those historical distortions that are so gross as to be either shameful or ludicrous. He continued, and listen to this very carefully. It is a notorious fact that there is not one single person in this House, in the Labour Party, who ever lifted a little finger in the constitutional struggle in this House. There was not one utterance from one of them when men were being thrown into prison for advocating self-government, when the governor was calling us traitors in that chair to the plaudits of the Legislative Council. Not one soul among them ever made an utterance in favor of nationhood and the advancement of our race and our people in this country. They reaped where they did not sow. Let them not betray it. Let them not pretend that they were the ones that planted the seeds. For I have not forgotten that from one end of the island in 1944 to the other end, the people were told by them that self-government meant slavery by the party that advocated self-government. When they did not tell the people it was slavery, they said it was brown man rule. Manley entertained some doubts regarding the authenticity and longevity of Bustamante's belated change on the question of self-government. As the leader of the majority party in the House, Bustamante had brought little energy to the issue, arousing Manley's fears about the strength of his commitment to the self-government mission. In 1952, a select committee was appointed to consider the question of self-government, and that committee had not met in 2 years, which suggested the absence of any energy in the ruling party. In fact, after 1953, the initiative for constitutional advance for the island came not from the Jamaican legislature, but from the governor and the colonial office. The ministerial system that was introduced in 1953 provided for 8 ministers. Again, the ruling party, the JLP, had nothing to do with that. In fact, when the House met in '53 to endorse Bustamante's appointment as the island's first chief minister, Donald Sangster praised Bustamante effusively, noting that the constitutional advances in the island were due to his, quote, activities and to his leadership. But this was an exaggeration, a transparent exercise in myth-making. History is an interesting thing, you know. The record is there. Norman Manley listened in silence as Sangster erased the more substantial contributions that many other people had made to the question of constitutional advance in the island. J.G. Smith, for example, Jack Smith. When he spoke, Manley acknowledged the contributions of many people, and he was careful not to denigrate the role of his political rival. This is what he said. When it comes to Jamaica's struggle to achieve political maturity, history will one day say, what were the forces that have made the past a possibility, the present a reality, and the future a certainty? Manley then said, many men have labored with shining devotion to the country in the field of that advance, and most of all, the people of the country have shown the capacity at all times to respond to any leadership which would point the way upward. Bustamante, incidentally, as the new chief minister, became more rhetorically strident and consistent in his support for self-government. His attendance at Queen Elizabeth's coronation ceremony in 1953 sort of pushed him in the direction of self-government, because he chafed again under the fact that colonial leaders were not given any kind of precedence in the ceremony in London. This was the leaders of the independent countries were the ones who received better seats and more attention and so on. And he came back to Jamaica livid, really mad, that he was, in a sense, denigrated in London. And he kept, and I'm moving on quickly, he kept saying, I see no reason why any Englishman should govern me. And he then went on to predict that I shall be the first Jamaican-born governor. Uncharacteristically for him, Bustamante injected the virus of British racism into the constitutional issue. Why haven't they given us self-government, he said. It's because we're of Negro blood. He belatedly recognized that, but most Jamaicans already knew that race was at the core of Jamaica's history. You can't rewrite that. Slavery was racial slavery, and that continued over time. It is still an important question. Fact, it's of great salience in the Jamaica in which we live today. Much less so than 100 years ago, but human worth has racial implications in this country, as of course it does in many of the societies of this hemisphere, including the one that has been most kind to me. But my voice is never silent on that question wherever I speak. And I'll have something else to say on this towards the end of my speech, and I'm hurrying along. But you know, one of the anachronisms was that in 1955, despite all this movement towards self-government, Jamaica celebrated what? 300 years of connection with the British Empire. It was the only colony that devoted an entire year to venerating and celebrating those ties. It was called Jamaica 300, the Jamaica Tercentenary. And what that showed was that it would be very difficult to remake a people, to have them think in new ways. This whole business today of having a referendum to whether to join the Caribbean Court of Appeals suggests the absence of confidence in our leaders to make rational and informed decisions. Even at a time when the Privy Council says, Lord, spare us from these people, we don't want to consider your cases anymore. But the mentality that drives that is one that you all have got to condemn. As some of us do in the United States, we condemn the existence of certain ways in which prejudice is enshrined in the people's thinking, and where the past is unfortunately a part of the present. But I digress. Bustamante, by the way, when he spoke on the occasion of the tercentenary celebrations, he told the children that the point of civilization that Jamaica has reached was due in large measure to Britain. Telling the children of ex-slaves, that sort of thing. He wanted the school children, he said, to be aware of the fact that Britain had brought civilization to Jamaica in the form of slavery, and they should not heed anybody who they might hear speaking disparagingly of Britain. One of the men I most admire in Jamaican political life has been Kenneth Hill, who said something very important on that occasion. He said, I would like to see the celebrations undertaken with a motive and theme that we have got where we are in spite of Great Britain, in spite of imperialistic rule and colonialism. And it is a function where we are today of our own reserves of strength, manpower, soul, and spirit. That we have struggled as far as we have got, and we are emerging in spite of handicaps with which we have been faced for 300 years. Regrettably, Manly's elevation to the office of Chief Minister in January 1955 did not, I stress not, accelerate the pace of the movement to self-government as one would have expected from a man who had embraced it many years earlier. He seemed to have been more preoccupied with growing the economy, which was good. Jamaica's economy by 1959 had become quite vibrant. And he was preoccupied with Jamaica's entry, potential entry into the Federation. So there was not much energy there, but there was energy at another level. In November 1957, the country received the cabinet system. The ministerial system had come in 1953, the cabinet government came in 1957, and I bet you would fail this quiz. When did independence come? Who knows? Not independence, I'm sorry, self-government, internal self-government. July 4th, 1959, with little fanfare, because the colonial office said you couldn't do too much of that because the general election was coming up, and they didn't want to politicize self-government, the achievement of that. It was? July 4th? But I read nonsense in the press these days about self-government coming in 1957. That's not true. Self-government and the cabinet system are entirely different. One builds on the other, of course. Let me ad-lib some of this, since time is going. In 58, Jamaica, of course, joined the West Indies Federation, but it was a federation built on very watery foundations. Manley was an ardent advocate, of course, and Bustamante was ambivalent. But he became increasingly strident in his opposition to the Union, declaring that it was not efficacious for the country as a whole, although he did, by the way, admit that he had been a part of making the Federation a reality. And when Jamaica decided by the referendum to secede, Bustamante gloated. But he gloated in spite of the fact that he was unprepared as a party and as a new government later on to assume the burdens and responsibilities of a new nation, as I shall suggest in a moment. I want questions, that's why I'm skipping forward. Manley, as you know, did call an election in 1960, right after the defeat in the referendum, and Bustamante won. That was a decent thing to do, because he was setting the precedent that the people were sovereign. And when this imbroglio over Prime Minister's lying to Parliament and remaining in office arose a couple of years ago, Jamaicans were insensitive to the fact that a new nation must set precedents that must prevail. You see, 100 years from now, people say, yeah, Golden did resign. But if he had stayed in office, a prime minister guilty of all kinds of malfeasance would have said, look, the precedent is that we don't have to force out a leader when things don't go well. Trinidadians, by the way, underwent a similar kind of problem. And, you know, I'm not afraid of anybody these days. I went to Port of Spain and said a prime minister who lies to Parliament, as Pamela had done, should go, which infuriated her supporters, but garnered me much attention in the ranks of the PNM. The current Prime Minister was in the audience, the Mayor of Port of Spain was in the audience, the Chief Justice was in the audience, and he took this little foreigner to come and say, look, you guys got to show some backbone here. As Jamaicans must show backbone when their government in office misbehaves. One of the ironies of Bustamante becoming the first Prime Minister of Jamaica was that the man who had opposed self-government for years earned that honor. But life is like that. And Jamaicans didn't care much because the moment was larger than the man. And we must always remember that. The moment is larger than the person, usually. Norman Manley, bitterly disappointed, played his part well, accepting his disappointment with dignity and uttering, and I have searched everywhere for this, uttering no public statements of pique, complaint, or regret. He was called in the campaign Mr. Referendum, and Mr. Referendum forgot about all of that once the people had voted and assumed the leadership now in the cause of making Jamaica a new nation. And I will end in about 10 minutes. The enthusiasm that greeted independence was not matched by any significant legislative action. The Bustamante government, and by extension I'm criticizing all of us, the Bustamante government did not inaugurate Jamaica's independence with bold, creative, and imaginative policies. In November 1962, a few months after independence was achieved, the British High Commissioner A.F. Morley blamed the septuagenarian Bustamante for the existing political malaise. There is doubt, the High Commissioner wrote, whether he, Bustamante, can impart the necessary drive and energy needed for the government to emerge as an effective supporter of the West and to get the economy moving forward again. He doubted Bustamante's capacity to accomplish this, noting that, quote, he is scarcely capable of discursive thought or even of coherent oratory. Remember, he was going on getting on in age, yeah? The High Commissioner's assessment of the new government became more negative as the months passed. By March 1963, he had been in the island for 7 months. It was 11 months since the JLP had taken office. Writing to Duncan Sandys, the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, the High Commissioner said, the dominant impression of Jamaican politics in these 7 months of independence is that nothing ever happens. The principal characters from time to time deliver speeches, mainly about the iniquities of each other, sometimes in language that is unusually forceful, but there is hardly any action. Morley, the High Commissioner, blamed the appearance of what he called immobility, in part on the inexperience of the ministers. He accused Bustamante of failure to provide leadership or ideas of his own. Bustamante, he said, at times seems reluctant, almost on principle, to entertain the ideas of others and succeeds effectively in frustrating everyone around him. The High Commissioner compared Bustamante to the aging Konrad Adenauer in West Germany, who was also clinging to political office. Morley, the High Commissioner, saw Bustamante as something of a minor Adenauer. There is something about this erect but rigid old man clinging to a few fixed ideas, and it would seem impervious to much else. The High Commissioner went on to say that the cabinet ministers, quote, still do not seem to have quite got over their surprise at being returned to power in April 1962. The cabinet as a whole, therefore, he said, elected as they were on the vaguest of promises, gives the impression of having very little clue as to what to do that will not look like they were complementing things started by Manley. And then he goes on to discuss individual ministers. He saw Sangster, the deputy prime minister, as possessing administrative drive. And he says it's largely Sangster who formulates decisions even in matters outside his sphere of responsibility. He says he's the only minister who dares openly to stand up to Bustamante. And Sangster's principal weakness, he said, is his lack of public appeal, that he was not charismatic. Robert Lightburn, the Minister of Trade and Industry, Morley thought had a quicker mind than Sangster's, but his judgment, quote, appears to be erratic. Shearer, he said, who was leader of government business, he said Shearer is a fluent and somewhat loudmouthed speaker, but he's reputed to enjoy life, and it is not certain that he would wish, even if he had the opportunity, to assume the burden of the highest office. Some of this is true, you know. Edward Siaga, the Minister of Development, according to Morley, quote, does not appear to be making rapid progress with his task of preparing a new long-term plan which will look, without in fact being notably different from that of Mr. Manley. Siaga, he says, a very hard worker, habitually taking on more than he can perform. And then he said he may emerge later as a relatively considerable figure in the JLP. Remember, he was a young man, very young in those days. John Giles, he praised as having courage and wisdom. 5 decades after Morley made these observations, it is undeniable that Jamaica has developed the infrastructure of a modern country. No doubt about that. Its network of highways is impressive, although the condition of the local roads is unacceptably poor. Its 2 international airports rank with the best in other developing countries. Access to medical care has been greatly expanded since 1962, although prenatal care in all of its dimensions still requires the active involvement of the government and the energies of a committed minister and informed minister. There have been tremendous strides in educational opportunities, but there needs to be a constant review of the curriculum of the schools and the universities, I might add, to command the interest of the students and meet the needs of a changing society. And by constant review, I mean that the Minister of Education and other interested parties must continue to monitor what students are being forced to learn and why. The relevance of some of the half-baked nonsense that I see in the curriculum. We need the energy, the foresight, the wisdom, and the courage to rethink, remake, reimagine, and implement. Jamaica is burdened by the crippling poverty of many of its citizens, and for these citizens, hope is a luxury. You just have to go anywhere and you see that, the hopelessness. People can't afford to imagine a better life. Their appalling condition has created for some a crippling despair and receptivity to the illusory promise of drugs and other extra-legal temptations. The violence that bedevils the society is a function of its deeper social ills. The high incidence of homicide both reflects and exacerbates these inner cancers. The unacceptably high killings of citizens by the police, several hundred per year, I don't know if you know these statistics, must be a source of serious concern and action at the highest levels of government. And so, and I stress this, must be the covert, and so must also end the covert official support, of uncivil behavior in the so-called garrison constituencies. Year after year, you find people writing about this. But what happens? What's the will? Because you know why? Some of the representatives of these garrison constituencies hold high office in the land. The low level of voter participation in the last 2 general elections is an indication of the people's declining belief in the capacity of the 2 parties to keep faith with the promise of the 1938 rebellion. There is a crippling cynicism about a pervasive corruption in the highest levels of the land. If these suspicions are accurate, and I say if, It is the responsibility of the political parties to cleanse themselves internally. It's the responsibility of the law enforcement authorities to do their job. And the newspapers have the responsibility to uncover existing malfeasance through in-depth investigative reporting. One need only recall a time in the second legislative term of 1949 to 54 when 2 ministers were jailed for corruption. Some of us remember that really well. But perhaps the greatest unmet challenge is that of improving the life chances of all the people. There must be a healthy debate not only about the nature of these challenges, but of the kinds of creative strategies that might be pursued to address them. Such discussions must transcend narrow partisan interests, and the learned faculty of the various universities can, there are a couple here I know, can and should play a critical role in leading and shaping those discussions. That's what universities do all over the world, particularly in developing societies. Are our universities doing that here? In fact, there are entirely too many universities in Jamaica that should not be so called. But one has no power over that. But the point I'm making is that the best minds are there, and it is up to them to expand the frontiers of the university, to speak with and to the people. And the political leadership should seek to learn from other societies, I've said this in Trinidad too, how other societies have addressed common problems. And we all can cross-fertilize one another. What can Jamaica, for example, learn from Costa Rica regarding agricultural policy and vice versa? What can Jamaica learn from Singapore and its approach to the development and nurturing of human resources? Or from New Jersey and its innovative public education curriculum, of which I headed a commission, this is self-serving, a commission a few years ago to take a look in New Jersey at how they went about educating their children for a rapidly changing society. Maybe this is being done here, but I'm not familiar with it. In my discussion with many of my fellow Jamaicans over the years, I have found a reluctance to embrace ideas that emanate from other societies. But the world is getting smaller, and there is the recognition that many of our existing problems transcend national boundaries and invite common solutions. As a modernizing society, Jamaica must also be committed to the eradication of bigotry, whether it's driven by the politics of gender, phenotype, or sexual orientation. No one chooses their gender or their sexual orientations, or their race for that matter, and no one should be penalized for being who they are. And our leaders should avoid pandering to the worst prejudices of the moment and avoid taking to the internet to embarrass a people and to embarrass those who courageously assert themselves, no matter what the motivation is. The times require enlightened, courageous, and informed leadership from the politicians, the religious leaders, and all those who shape thinking in the society. Martin Luther King spoke of the creation of a beloved society in the United States, one where decency, tolerance, common understandings, and social justice would prevail. The United States is still in the process of becoming that kind of society, and its journey is far from complete. But King was also imagining the kind of society that Jamaica can and should become. 54 years is a short time in the trajectory of a nation state, so our assessment of Jamaica's condition must be tempered by that reality. The second half century of the country must continue to build upon its notable achievements, and those who would exercise leadership must think less of personal ambitions and gain, and more of the espousal and adoption of policies that uplift those who have been marginalized and diminished as fellow human beings. They must eschew corrosive political language, and they must eschew the winking at politically inspired threats, violence, and intimidation. There's far too much of that in this beloved land. We need people to inspire us and to speak to our better angels. As one who was present in that arena when Jamaica was officially born as a nation state, I worry that the island has not kept faith with its founding promise. Its greatest asset still remains its people. Their creative energies are still vibrant and are yet to be fully marshaled by leaders in the cause of progressive change, decency, and tolerance. Our leaders must be sensitive to the eventual judgment of history, as I'm trying to do now, to manifest the best in themselves and bring out the best in the people, and to make of Jamaica an example of dynamic and progressive social change, tolerance, political stability, and social justice. When Sir Alexander Bustamante, the first Prime Minister, gave his address in that arena that night when Jamaica became independent, he expressed the hope, and I'm quoting, that Jamaicans will respond to the challenge of this new era in which we now enter, and to the different tasks, and to the difficult tasks and heavy responsibilities ahead of you. That remains our task and our enduring challenge. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any criticisms, questions, whatever.
Your comments on Norman Manley's role during the 1955 to 62 period was very interesting. But the question I have for you is any recognition made of the work that he did to create the institutional framework for us to enable us to meet independence?
No, he didn't. No. Number one, there is no existing study of that, and I have studied that period intensively. Remember that Norman Manley, in those years, his focus was on creating the institutional structure for the Federation and less about Jamaica. Jamaica, in his imagination, would become a part of an active part of the Federation and play a leadership role. So if you look at all those years, 55, 56, 57, the meetings, the conferences in Trinidad and in London and so on, those were the conferences that were laying the institutional foundation for the Federation. And as I said in the brief time I devoted to this, to that aspect, the initiative actually for the constitutional advances in Jamaica after 1955 came not from Manley, came not from Bustamante, but came from the colonial office. So there won't be much there because his interest changed. But you know, there's also which I didn't have time to even mention this, but in 57 or 58, there was a debate in the House. And Edwin Allen, remember Edwin Allen? Rose to say, I wish we were talking about independence for Jamaica. There was that doubt, and he was a very informed man, and was expressing regret that Jamaica was leaning towards the Federation. And Manly rose, and you could see the ambivalence. Manly said, I think I agree with you, but let's not go back to the past. Let's go forward. And that was a defining moment, because I got the impression as I read all these speeches that the man's heart was not in it after 58, 59, and 60, but he had become a prisoner of his own rhetoric, a prisoner of his pro-federation rhetoric. I still don't know, by the way, whether the referendum was a good thing for Jamaica. I leave that to another historian at some later day to say the Jamaicans do the right thing by withdrawing. And notice, look what happened in Britain a couple months ago when they thought of Jamaica in the referendum. On the other hand, I am convinced that in the distant future, maybe all of us here will be dead and gone, but there will be a federation of the West Indies again, because size still matters. Although Britain has come out of the European Union, or will come out, there's still 27 other nations there. In a talk I gave someplace, I ridiculed the idea of, Nevis, or Anguilla, 14,000 people talking about independence in a world where, the population of New York City is 8 million. And Anguilla, 14,000 talking about independence? Where is the money going to come from to have foreign embassies and that sort of thing? It's nonsense. But petty nationalism, that's what's going on. Petty nationalism drove the impetus to federation, to impetus against federation in Jamaica.
While you were talking about Mr. Manley's major focus being on the federation, what about things like Jamaica welfare, for instance, which would definitely have had, a Jamaican national, rural as well as urban focus?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that history will, I think, emphasize down the road is that the decision to federate were made by the leaders in the halls of the legislatures, in conferences in London and Port of Spain and so on. In spite of the fact that on the ground, the people were not too enamored of this union and were manifesting a Jamaican nationalism. You see, a belief in their own capacity to govern themselves and to conduct their own affairs. And Bustamante exploited this, or built upon it, whatever word you want to use. Yes, there was some energy, but the energy on the ground was more Jamaican nationalist energy and less of a federal nationalist energy. But most Jamaicans, as the vote showed, 35,000 Jamaicans, it was a majority of 35,000 Jamaicans when the votes were counted on September 19th, 1961. I don't know if this answers you, but I'm saying that those voices were there.
Yeah, I think the point that I was making
Yeah.
though was that when you talk about Norman Manley,
Mhm.
that Jamaica welfare, if I'm not mistaken, was very essentially one of his major focuses,
Yeah.
and that was a nationalist focus.
Yes.
Even within the broader
Yes,
appreciation
yes,
of
yes,
federation.
of course.
So I think that was the point.
Of course, and of course the vote to secede was a nationalist vote. And you see, the problem here was that Manley was the nationalist par excellence. Jamaica this, Jamaica that. And then, by dint of circumstances or as a result of British pressure, he became the foremost exponent of a federal nationalism. And the two just didn't jive. It was a dilemma for him.
Yes, Colin, in the political language of the mid to late 1940s,
Yeah.
did the term dominion status mean independence?
Yes. Yes. Remember, it was a term derived from the fact that Canada and Australia and these places had dominion status. And-
Just a slight
Yeah.
follow-up question.
Yeah.
Have you located when and where the word independence began to creep into the language of the politicians?
As opposed to dominion status,
Yeah.
I would hazard a guess in 1959. 59, particularly when the Labour Party shifted to outright opposition to dominion status. They spoke about independence for Jamaica. Remember the drive in the motto behind the referendum was Jamaica yes, Federation no. And Jamaica yes was a metaphor, so to speak, for independence. There's a forthcoming book called Inward Yearnings, Jamaica's move towards independence or nationhood, that will come out in hopefully next month in UWI Press, and I was privileged to be the author of that book that examines Jamaica's search not only for a racial identity but a political identity.
Douglas?
Yes, you see a bit more about the relationship with the unions. Both political parties are associated with unions.
Yes.
And I didn't hear you say much about how what was happening in the trade union movement, how that impacted possibly the perspective of either Norman Manley or Bustamante in shifting possibly their thinking. The other thing too is the fact that it is correct that Norman Manley in particular, you notice my initial comments about the man with the plan, is in fact his work is seminal in terms of the legislative framework for planning and development, because the Town and Council Planning Act of Jamaica was formulated under his watch. And of course he established the Central Planning Agency, what is now the Planning Institute of Jamaica. So in both those two areas, it's the trade union element from both of them, and Manley's thinking in terms of institutions, notwithstanding his support for federation.
Yeah. Let me deal with the second question first. The man with the plan, of course, was was associated with the election of 1950, January 12, 1955, and Manley had presented a very thoughtful manifesto, and Bustamante said, what happens if the man in the plan flies away with it? What's going to happen? You know, Bustamante had these catchy phrases. You're correct. It was much less an institutional focus. It was more a focus on how to develop this island economically. Remember, one of the first things he did was to go off to Europe or the US to bring back George Cadbury. And during those first 4 years, the economy took off. And there was rational thinking. There was a 5-year plan and so on. And the Minister of Education, for example, Glasspool introduced a whole series of reforms, expanding scholarship opportunities and that sort of thing. In health, you also, the creation of clinics. Of course, Michael would expand on that many years later, and I hope the present Prime Minister still realizes that that is unfinished business, the health of the people. So it was less an institutional approach. If by institution we mean putting in the rules and the trappings, the administrative trappings, so to speak. So, but the energy was there, the foresight was there, and the achievements were there. Insofar as the unions are concerned, I know less about that. The BITU was, of course, Bustamante's organ, which, as you know, led to a split in 1961 when Mrs. Rose Lynn, one of their more energetic characters, was forced out, in part because she wanted to separate the union from the party. And Bustamante really didn't see much of a distinction, and she was forced out partially for that. But I have read every single issue of the Gleaner since 1936 to 1962, and I have yet to see any comment from the unions either on federation or on independence. I have missed it. So I'm simply saying that I have no information on that, but it may be something, a challenge somebody here in this audience might undertake.
Yes, Colin, can I greet you? Well, I would like to comment on timely in relation to independence. And to begin by saying we are dealing with a very complex man as well as a very complex historical period. I appreciated and I hope the audience did your distinctions of independence, its locality or its location in New York or in America, the notion of self-government and the notion of dominion status. Let me take the last one first because I want to place the relationship between Jamaica, and I want to modify the word Jamaica as soon as we have spoken it. Our problem as historians is quite often to identify geography and history in place of name. Of name. Jamaica runs from West East St. Thomas to Montego Bay. But in between, there are several Jamaicas. Just like in the PNP, Paulina, I think she brought it up, but the mark that made me want to speak about it was reference to Edwin Allen. I must remark with every man in the house. There are several Jamaicas, and there are several Trinidadians and Guyanas and so on. The earliest of the Dominion has a phrase for independence, not self-government, but independence, really was in the South Carolina. Marriage showing the later. And the reason was that they had run into an element in the Caribbean towards the end of the 19th century in which the principal reason for denying this capacity or the experiment in self-government was race. I hope I'm not going to be going too far into detail, but remember in the middle of that 19th century, Britain was going from free trade, from protection to free trade. With the 1840s immediately in effect after emancipation, the sugar economy in the Caribbean had crashed. By the 1870s, we were broke. I'm identifying myself as the owners of plantations. We were broke. And it was the ground for cultivating crown colony government. The passing away of the concept of self-rule among the whites and the other. One of my colleagues, William Wilmot, has researched and written extensively, my colleague is probably the people there, on the way in which the politics of the Caribbean, the English-speaking colonies in the 50s were really grounded in the capacity of the ownership of a large number of the emancipated to own property. They always voting with a property qualification. And these people were not white. And the vested politics, together with the Jewish commercial class, were really quite varied, and the capacity for self-government to the vestries in Jamaica manifested itself. And in the Eastern Caribbean, in Jamaica in particular, among the Eastern Caribbean and Barbados, well, Trinidad, not yet, this element of the tradition of self-government in the manner in which the American colonies have been self-governing. This element persisted, and it was the residuary sugar plantation management and the ownership of property in England by white people really that influenced the colonial office resistance to the passing of power to the local population. And Marishaw, recognizing the resistance, did not use the word, abandon using the word, because at first he spoke of independence, but he abandoned using the word independence for dominion status, as you correctly said, on the border of Canada. Because Australia.
No, I was just going to say that we want to thank you for your input, Prof. And to ask, yes, and just ask you to wrap up so that Professor Tam can respond.
Let me regroup with the manual. Because I want to suggest that unless we think of manual in the time or the context of 45 Act, and the context is that the federal issue came out of the Moynihan Report. And the role of the British government towards self-government, not yet independence, but self-government, and then independence, is characteristic of what they were doing in implementing the parts of the Moynihan Commission that they thought would work. So here is Manley maneuvering, as you were saying, between the business of going to the colonial office, because the evidence in the colonial office was on the one hand willing to lose, but on the other hand, I got indicated on the grounds that the white influence in the Caribbean and in England kept holding back the colonial office from going the way they wanted, which was really taking drop, we can't say what they're doing there. And in that source, money, I think, was affected. And also wanting to establish, and this is common, and I want to stress it, these men were really foxed by the desire to go to govern themselves or to administer themselves, and the business of establishing federal government, because federation was an alternative government to the Jamaican government. And that was the problem they were trying to work out and couldn't work out. And then it was there. I want to follow your example I say it with my own comfortable. But one of the elements there in the PNP was Manley's fear that he did not have the support of Gaskell and Will Isaacs. And this was born to me because I was campaigning for federation. And until the very last moment, Gaskell was in Puerto Rico or Will Isaacs. These two men never campaigned for the federation. Manley did it alone and at the last moment, Michael. And the rural areas were really neglected. I was in PJ Patterson in Montego Bay on the Saturday on the boat. And we were coming around the island from Montego Bay to the south. And when Michael was going north past us, my heart leapt. When I thought, oh God, it's in Tampa, we can save it. So we have to take into account one reason that they were affected Manley was the fear that if he went federal, the PNP would be divided in a conflict between Will Isaacs and Gaskell. But the truth is, neither of them were in favor of federal enough to work to save the referendum. I could say more, but in a good business.
I hope you could hear, because this was a rich what Professor Uche was sharing, and it comes right back to his early comments when he said there are several Jamaicans. You know, very, very important point to me.
There's so many themes there, which one, of course, is that there are several Jamaicas, and the federal referendum reflected that very starkly when the rural areas, except I think for St. Anne, went voted to secede. And there are only 3 parishes that voted to stay: Kingston, St. Andrew, and St. Anne. So there was this urban-rural dichotomy, and in the parishes, of course, the urban centers like Montego Bay and so on tended to be pro-federation and whatnot. In the internal wrangling in the PNP, I think you need to add Vernon Arnett. It's not known that Arnett came out in a lengthy letter to Manley. He says, "I'm sorry, I can't support this." And I think Manley must have asked him to cool it, to not make any public pronouncements, because that would have hurt the cause of the pro-federation forces. In the JLP, there were, of course, pro-federation people, including Edwin Allen, but who, and Don Sansa, both were very supine people, very, Bustamante said jump, and they would ask how high. Sansa in particular was a committed federationist and went with the wind. So both parties had this kind of internal division. The country was certainly divided along class lines and location and so on. As far as the larger Caribbean is concerned and all these political forces, those rebellions of the 1930s were important in stimulating not only local reaction, but reaction with colonial office. And the desire to give, or the decision to give Jamaica universal adult suffrage, and so on. These were designed to prepare these little islands for self-government, but at the same time to prepare them to think in terms of a federation which would become independent. Britain, as you know, had reached a point where these islands had become a drain on their coffers and wanted to get rid of them. And that was always Bustamante's point, by the way, that if you're going to get rid of us, give us the money. And he was opposed to a federation of paupers. But you see, things across the world were changing. You had Ghana, Nigeria, you had the Mamas in Kenya, you had the Indians who had been fighting for many, many years, Malaysians and so on. So this desire to get rid of the West Indians was a part of the larger decolonization mission that Britain had begun to embrace. Of course, there were those who thought that this was the end of law and order and a diminution in white power. And in fact, in 1944 in Jamaica, the white bastions of wealth decided to support the least qualified politicians, hoping that nigger government, as they put it, would fail, and this would mean an abrogation of the Constitution. It didn't happen. Nigger government didn't fail. Bustamante was not a particularly successful leader, but the country grew. Some very distinguished men and women came to the forefront over time. The civil service here was wonderful. Those people had no precedence, but there's some very distinguished civil servants who need a book on them, because they created something out of nothing. And they were the people who really held the society together when it was being buffeted by all kinds of forces, and also suffering from the whims of the elected leaders.
Yes, I think there's a young man here who wants to either make a comment or ask a question.
Yes,
Are
sir.
there any others? Okay, so this will be our last.
I hope it's critical.
Okay.
Greetings, sir. When one uses history as a tool, it makes it powerful. And I want to ask you this question. Having researched both the Federation and the independence, two concepts, you're powerful enough, I think, to tell me what would be the difference if we had a federal government now, as opposed to independence. I think you're that powerful to make that.
Remember, I, maybe in a moment of caution, 20 minutes ago, I said the verdict is, but if you really want to push me, but before I get to the pushing part, remember I also said that there is going to be a movement to federation, not in our lifetime perhaps, but down the road. And so to that extent, don't throw any stones at me now. I think that vote was a mistake. Or I could argue that the federation was premature. The groundwork hadn't been done to make people begin to think of themselves primarily not as Trinidadians and Jamaicans, but as West Indians. They become West Indians in New York. You see, but we were armored. I lived through all that. In fact, I gave my first political speech as a young teenager in St. James during the federal campaign on a platform organized by Dr. C.A. Morgan. You remember? From Malden Baptist Church. He was the MP for Southeastern St. James. And I spoke, maybe foolishly, in favor of federation. I didn't know that. I just had a big mouth. And was then teaching at Branch, Texas College, just out of Clarendon College. But anyway, I am disappointed in what Jamaica has accomplished in the last 50 years. I've seen lost promises. I've seen an absence of vision. I've seen the corruption of the body politic. I have seen a corrosive debate that diminishes people. I have seen the will to economic power individually. I smell the corruption that cancerously destroys a people. I have seen Jamaicans turn inward. The Americans are not doing that, by the way, with what's going on. It's terrible, and so on. But the leadership, you see, one of our finest leaders, although he ended up dividing the country, was Michael Manley in terms of his vision. His father, of course, is in a different category, and I've written 3 books on leadership in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Guyana and Jamaica. And Manley stands head and shoulders above Eric Williams and Chetty Jagan, and of course, who's the other guy in Guyana? Vernon. You see, the decency that Manley manifested, even in moments of deep despair, has not yet been approximated here. In other words, the leaders who've come since then have not manifested that kind of high-mindedness, that kind of devotion to the public. Well, he made mistakes too. He wasn't a saint. I mean, he was infected by a kind of class consciousness that distanced him from the people he served. My new book shows his attitude towards A.G.S. Coombs and F.L.B. Evans, and his tendency to refer to people as ignoramuses and so on. And it had very few friends, among the people in whose name he spoke. Lots of negative stuff. But over and beyond that, he was as clean as a whistle. In fact, Manley died almost a poor man because he funded the activities of the PNP and also party members in distress. We can't say the same thing about Bustamante. Did you read my book, Freedom's Children? I don't know how many of you have read it, but there are some unpleasant things in there that I was told not to include. But OJ tells me to tell the truth. And that's there, you see? But anyway, this is your generation now, my friend, and call your leaders to higher promise. And you have the press. Be courageous. But thank you, folks. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.